Welcome back after the break. Now for stories in detail. We start from Afghanistan, where nearly 60 Afghan soldiers and insurgents have been killed in fresh nationwide clashes. 27 others were wounded in fighting. Taliban said 37 Afghan security personnel were killed in attacks in Ghazni, Kunduz and Logar provinces. The Afghan Interior Ministry said that 20 Taliban fighters were killed in ground operations in Maidan Wardak and Farah provinces. Meanwhile, death toll from yesterday's Taliban attack on a US-funded aid group in Kabul has risen to 11. The Interior Ministry said that 4 civilians were among those killed. Moving on, the US has imposed fresh sanctions on Iran amid mounting tensions between the two countries. President Donald Trump issued an executive order imposing sanctions on Iran's steel, aluminium, copper and iron industries. The White House said that the order covers Iran's largest source of non-oil revenue. It said that more action could be taken against Iran unless it fundamentally alters its conduct. Earlier, Iran threatened to resume uranium enrichment if pledges made under a 2015 deal are not fulfilled. President Rouhani has set a 60-day deadline for world powers to implement their commitments made under the deal on Iran's nuclear program. Trump pulled the US out of the deal last year and imposed unilateral sanctions on Iran. Meanwhile, the US military has said a B-52 bomber task force will soon be deployed to the Middle East. US Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Joseph Dunford has defended an earlier decision to send an aircraft carrier to the Persian Gulf. He said the move was intended to confront Iranian threats to US forces.
We saw the intelligence, and so we sent some messages on Friday to make sure that it was clear to Iran that we recognized the threat and we were postured to respond to the threat. What I asked really was to accelerate the movement of the Lincoln and the Bomber Task Force so that there would be no ambiguity about our preparedness to respond to any threat against our people or our partners in the region. And that's why we worked pretty hard to do that, because what we didn't want to do is be in a position to respond. We wanted to make sure that we took as much action as we could over the weekend to actually deter that.
Meanwhile, US President Donald Trump has extended unilateral sanctions against Syria for 1 more year. In his message to the Congress, Trump said that the Syrian regime poses an extraordinary threat to US national security. He condemned Syrian President Bashar Assad's use of violence and human rights abuses in war. Meanwhile, the US State Secretary Mike Pompeo has told all countries to take back their citizens who fought for ISIS in Syria. He urged Britain, France and Germany to take back more than 800 captured militants and put them on trial. Pompeo said these terrorists shall be contained to avoid additional risk to anyone, anywhere in the world. US President Donald Trump has accused China of breaking a deal in ongoing trade talks. He threatened to impose higher tariffs on Chinese imports later this week. China has said it would retaliate with necessary countermeasures. Trump said he will maintain punitive tariffs on Chinese goods until it stops stealing American workers' jobs. He threatened to hike tariffs on Chinese goods from 10% to 25%. Trump's comments came ahead of the resumption of trade talks in Washington today. Chinese Vice Premier Liu He will attempt to salvage the trade negotiations, which had appeared close to success. But Trump believes the US would stand to benefit with no deal from China.
So they're flying in. The Vice Premier tomorrow is flying in. Good man. But they broke the deal. They can't do that. So they'll be paying. We don't make the deal. Nothing wrong with taking in over $100 billion a year.
For more on this, we are joined by our Beijing correspondent, Patrick Falk. Thank you, Patrick, for joining us. So firstly, can China avert the imposition of additional US tariffs, or has that ship sailed?
Well, there's certainly not a lot of optimism for a positive outcome at this point. The Chinese have actually been very measured in their response and very composed in their response to Donald Trump's latest tariff threat, suggesting that they do still want to come to the negotiating table. But that may also be seen by the Americans as the Chinese dragging their feet and not bring the two sides where they need to be. But one big question really is, what exactly is Liu He bringing to Washington with him? Is he going to put these concessions that the US has accused China of reneging on back on the table, or is he really just coming to soften the blow with the inevitable, which is that the US is going to slap fresh tariffs on China as early as Friday? Remember, the Chinese aren't happy about some of the concessions that negotiators made in the most recent rounds of discussions, particularly because there was no guarantee that Trump was going to remove any of the existing tariffs. So there is a sense that they were giving away too much with too little in return. So that is perhaps one area where there may be some room for negotiation. But as I say, there's not a ton of optimism at this point.
And economists have warned that additional US tariffs on China would tip the global economy into recession. Are trade issues being overshadowed by Trump's populist politics?
Well, look, there's no doubt that this is playing out well with Donald Trump's supporter base. They like it that he's getting tough on China. And he also has support in some quarters of the Democratic camp, who believe that the US is getting a raw deal out of trade with China. It is a fact that there is a big trade imbalance between the two countries. There's also a big question mark as to who exactly is paying for these tariffs. There is one popular opinion among some quarters that Americans are in fact paying for all of this, but the reality is that both suppliers in China and businesses as well as consumers are paying. So everybody's hurting as a result of this. The question really is who is able to withstand the headwinds the best.
Right, and lastly, Patrick, China's economy has shown signs of responding to government stimulus despite the trade war with the United States. How resilient is China's economy?
Well, look, China has threatened to retaliate, but there is only so much that it can do. Its options are limited by virtue of the fact that there is a big trade imbalance between the two countries. If it does decide to target the US economically, it may target the agricultural sector and Donald Trump's supporter base in particular, but there's not so much it can do in terms of retaliation as far as tariffs go. At the same time, though, China does definitely believe that it is resilient enough to be able to withstand any potential shock, and it says, in fact, that it has tremendous confidence in its position in the global supply chain, and that countries like Vietnam and India may be trying to emulate China, but that isn't going to change overnight. And as long as it can keep its position, it does have confidence in the long term that it can continue to grow, even if analysts believe that it'll struggle to keep at 6% growth for 2019.
Thank you, Patrick Falk, for your time. That was Patrick joining us from Beijing. Next, Russia is commemorating the 74th anniversary of its victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. The Russians see the Great Patriotic War as a conflict that created national cohesion.
Victory Day honors the millions of Red Army soldiers and civilians who perished in the conflict. Ahead of the annual parade in Moscow's Red Square, President Vladimir Putin welcomed veterans of the World War II. A moment of silence was observed in memory of Russians who perished. Putin used the occasion to emphasize the need to build Russia's defensive capabilities.
We have been doing and will do everything possible to ensure high battle readiness of our armed forces, the most modern level defense potential.
The Victory Day parade showcased Russia's military strength. Missiles, tanks and warplanes were the highlights of the event.
Next, North Korea has test-fired more missiles, stoking tensions with the United States and its regional allies. This comes as a U.S. envoy held talks in Seoul on breaking the deadlock in denuclearization talks with North Korea. South Korea's military said that the missiles were fired from North Pyongan province. This launch comes days after Pyongyang carried out a military drill and fired multiple short-range missiles. A North Korean official said Saturday's routine drill was conducted within its own waters. He said that the flying objects did not pose any threat to the US, South Korea and Japan. In another development, Thailand's main opposition party has won the most seats in the country's first general elections since 2014 military coup, but it will not get to choose the country's next leader despite claiming more seats than anyone else. Thai Election Commission said the Pheu Thai party has secured 136 seats in the lower house. Pro-military Palang Pracharat party bagged 115 seats. It is only 11 votes shy of a majority in the combined parliament thanks to the backing of 250 military-appointed senators. This means if Pracharat seeks support of smaller parties, it will be able to form the government. South Africa's ruling African National Congress Party is leading in early results of the 6th general election since apartheid. According to the Election Commission, the ruling party is 26% ahead of the Democratic Alliance. President Cyril Ramaphosa has reinvigorated support for the ruling party that forced Jacob Zuma to resign last year. Most opinion surveys suggest the ruling party will secure nearly 60% of the vote. Some 26.8 million registered voters cast ballots to elect new National Assembly and provincial legislatures. In another development, U.S. President Donald Trump has invoked executive privilege to block full Russia report release. Democrats condemned the White House for defying a House committee's subpoena seeking the report. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Gerald Nadler said the move is blanket defiance of Congress's constitutional mandate. White House spokesperson Sarah Sanders said the actions of Democrats had forced the move. She accused Committee Chairman Nadler of violating the law.
Chairman Nadler is again trying to violate the law. The president and the attorney general are the ones that are actually upholding it. And as long as Congress and this committee continue to ask the attorney general to commit a crime, the president and the attorney general will continue to actually uphold the law.
In Latin America, Venezuelan intelligence agencies have arrested the deputy leader of the National Assembly, Edgar Zambrano. He was arrested on the charges of backing the April 30th uprising against the government of President Nicolas Maduro. Zambrano is a close aide of opposition leader Juan Guaido. In a tweet just before his arrest, Zambrano said a unit of security personnel had surrounded his vehicle outside his office in Caracas. The U.S. has called the arrest illegal and inexcusable. Washington warned Maduro's government if it would face consequences if Zambrano is not freed immediately. Moving on, France's President Emmanuel Macron has called for a ceasefire in the month-long battle for Libya's capital, Tripoli. This comes after Libyan Prime Minister Fayez al-Sarraj met Macron to discuss France's support to the Eastern Forces. Relations between the two leaders have soured since Eastern Forces commander Khalifa Haftar launched a campaign against the government. France has denied it supports the Tripoli offensive, but has echoed Haftar's assertion that terrorists need to be fought. French President Emmanuel Macron said there is no military solution to the Libyan conflict. On April the 4th, Haftar launched an offensive towards Tripoli, triggering fighting which has claimed 400 lives. Earlier, PM Sarraj also met Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte and German Chancellor Angela Merkel to garner support against Haftar. Paris, Rome, Berlin and London coordinated to organize Sarraj's visits across Europe for finding a solution to the crisis. World Health Organization has warned about outbreak of deadly diseases in Libya due to a fresh wave of violence. Civilian casualties can also increase as warring sides are using sophisticated weapons.
Libya has spiraled into political chaos and civil war since the toppling of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. Tension rose between the warring factions after Khalifa Haftar's forces started advancing towards Tripoli last month. According to WHO, at least 443 people, including 23 civilians, have been killed in the last month. The WHO representative in Libya has said civilian casualties can increase due to intense fighting.
The numbers will increase definitely because their fighting is closing down towards the center of or the more populated areas in Tripoli, where then there is a highly likelihood that more and more civilians will be trapped into the crossfire.
Since the start of fighting, 60,000 people have fled the fighting and taken refuge in the makeshift camps. WHO feared outbreak of different diseases in refugee camps due to poor hygiene conditions.
There is a likelihood now of cholera, for example, in these IDP dwellings because the water sanitation is compromised. TB outbreaks because especially among the migrant population, they are coming from high endemic areas. So, and then many other waterborne diseases like enteric fever.
WHO is seeking an additional $12 million from donors to cater to the swelling number of people affected by the war.
The United Nations has warned that its agencies providing health and food assistance to Gaza are facing serious paucity of funds.
Palestinians are gripped in a grave humanitarian crisis amid the escalated tensions in the country. The UN Humanitarian Coordinator, Jamie McGoldrick, has urged fundraising to cope with the health crisis and food shortage. The United Nations has said 1,700 Palestinians shot by Israeli forces in Gaza may need amputations in the next 2 years. It is the lack of health funding and facilities that is risking so many limbs. The UN is seeking $20 million to fill the gap in health spending. Its spokesperson has said at least 9,000 Palestinians have been wounded in protests in the past year.
1,700 people who are in need of serious, complicated surgeries for them to be able to walk again. These are people who have been shot during the demonstrations and who are in need of rehabilitation and very, very serious and complex bone reconstruction surgery over a 2-year period before they start to rehabilitate themselves. The unfortunate issue is that we don't have the capacity, we don't have the technical ability, we don't have the resources, and unfortunately many of the people who are involved in that might end up being amputees. And it's a tragic situation when many of these people are of working age.
The UN's World Food Programme for Refugees provides food assistance to over 1 million people in Gaza. This year, only 14% of the funds have been received for humanitarian aid for West Bank and for Gaza.
We would envisage if WFP and UNRWA don't get around $40 million by the end of May, beginning of June, they will not be able to order the pipeline because you have to order the pipeline well in advance, and then there'll be a problem with the food supply to populations in the second half of the year.
The UN Relief Agency plans to host a donors conference next month to fill the funds void left after US withdrew its support.
In another important development, Sudan's protesters and opposition leaders have called for civil disobedience. They said the call for civil disobedience has been given after the military's disappointing response to constitutional proposals. This comes a day after military rulers partially agreed with proposals made by protest leaders on the structure of an interim government. Sudan is in a political turmoil since the army took power after ousting President Omar al-Bashir on April the 11th. The military coup followed months of protests against Bashir's iron-fisted rule, but since then the military council has resisted calls to hand over powers to civilians. In the UK, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has arrived in London to pitch a post-Brexit special relationship between the two countries.
British Prime Minister Theresa May has been grappling for 3 years with the political crisis over Britain's planned exit from the European Union. As Britain tries to exit the European Union, Pompeo will give a speech on America's special relationship with the United Kingdom. Earlier, Prime Minister Theresa May said the British government is working to reach a Brexit agreement with the opposition Labour Party.
We are indeed talking with the Labour Party. I think there's a very clear message that was given to this House last week from the public. It is that they want us to get on and deliver Brexit. I think it's absolutely right that we do so, and we're working on an agreement that can command a majority of this House. If the Right Honourable Gentleman is so keen for us to get on with delivering Brexit, why didn't he vote for the deal in the first place?
Prime Minister May is under growing pressure to leave the office sooner than she plans.
Washington, D.C. is set to open its all-new and well-expanded International Spy Museum on Sunday. The museum has a vast collection of ingenious gadgets and real-world tools.
The world of espionage has been revolutionized by modern changes in technology and politics. Washington's all-new Spy Museum is set to open this weekend. It contains 7,000 spy artifacts, which are mostly donated by intelligence historian and private collector H. Keith Melton.
Over a 45-year period of collecting artifacts, the artifact I searched for the longest was the Trotsky ice axe. And it was a challenge to find, and then it took me 3 years to firmly establish the provenance and prove convincingly that this was the piece.
The museum offers a new look into the world of espionage. It features the work of both heroes and traitors in the annals of intelligence.
There are more spies operating in the U.S. today than at any point in our history. Spying is more important today than at any point in our history. The objective of spies has never changed. The only thing that changes is the technology that they use to accomplish it.
The museum has a massive collection of espionage gear from around the world. Apart from spy gadgets and devices, spies are a primary focus.
An old Rohingya violinist has found solace in music at a Bangladeshi refugee camp, where he is free to play music here for the first time in decades. This report has more.
75-year-old Amir Ali learned to play violin as a child after becoming obsessed with the instrument. Belonging to a wealthy family in Myanmar, Ali and his friends used to play together in a band. Now their venue is a bamboo shelter in a Bangladeshi camp, and their audience is a curious crowd of fellow refugees.
When we fled from Myanmar, we could not bring anything except the cloth I wore. I could not even get a chance to take my violin. Usually our band gather and play on Tuesdays. The audience enjoy our music when we play on other occasions as well.
Myanmar has imposed stifling restrictions on the Rohingya. They were prevented from traveling, gathering in groups, and expressing their ethnicity. Getting permission to perform was nearly impossible, but Amir Ali still loves his homeland.
I love my country very much, and I am happy to be a native. I play violin here whenever I feel sad because it brings me joy. It is very sad that we have become homeless. We miss our home and land a lot.
While life in the camp is bleak and monotonous, refugees enjoy relatively more freedom in Bangladesh than they endured in Rakhine State.